All right. I guess the first thing I want to say is I bring greetings from Clear Creek Chapel and the other elders. Uh, we have, as a church, our church is just south of Dayton in Springboro. We average anywhere between 240, 260 on a Sunday. So of the churches here, along with Ed and Raf, I feel a lot of camaraderie with Ed and Reed because I know we represent a couple of the larger assemblies. And, I think the rest of you should know that you've got friends at Clear Creek. We recently did a sermon series on New Covenant theology. And we are working. In fact, one of my colleagues, one of the other men there at the church, a close friend, was the main one responsible for the series. He could not come. He wished he could have come. And at some point, I think you'll probably see him here as well. But there are others working and developing New Covenant theology with the understanding that this is something new, something in redemptive history that there's a lot of potential for work that needs to be done. And so in our little corner, our little neck of the woods, that's what's occurring at Clear Creek Chapel. Our subject, at least the subject matter that I have been tasked with, is the Sermon on the Mount and the Old Testament. It's been a great study. And of course, anybody that's taught knows, when you do a study, you're probably impacted as much as anybody who's ever going to bother listening. I'm convinced more than ever that a proper understanding of the Sermon on the Mount is fundamental to covenant or New Covenant theology. Somebody mentioned the fact last night that there are some within our little band of friends that don't really see the sermon, don't really see Matthew 5:17 through 20 especially, as critical to understanding New Covenant theology. The more I jumped into this particular study and the more I looked at the sermon, the more I understood what was happening in the sermon, what Matthew is doing, especially in his treatment of the Sermon on the Mount, the more I became convinced that's not the case. Certainly, probably, if we were to poll all of us, we would probably come, I think most of us would agree that 2 Corinthians 3 is ground zero for the discussion. However, Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, goes a long way, especially as we think about Christ's ministry, Christ's life, how he understood himself, how he taught about himself, how he preached about himself. This is a critical passage to understanding New Covenant theology, and I would posit that even as we move forward in our discussion of New Covenant theology, that Matthew 5 is one of those key texts that we will constantly be referring to, especially, and it's interesting, we may not think that it's a critical passage, but certainly those who critique us do. And they want to run to Matthew 5 every time. So we have to deal with this passage. We have to come up with an answer. And some good answers have been proposed. And I'm going to reference later on, I'll reference Tom Wells and Fred Zaspel's book. I think as much as there were things in it I found problematic, they at least put this passage front and center. And I like the way they handled some of the issues in that book. So hopefully this is not critiquing New Covenant theology per se. Hopefully this is going to move. I hope everything that we do this week in terms of the Sermon on the Mount are helping move this ball forward. There are things here in this Matthew passage and I'm going to reference them as we move through here, that I'm seeing for the first time. This has been a learning experience for me. And hopefully it's not the last things that I'm going to see in this passage. I see us, especially those of us, again, that call ourselves New Covenant, we're on a journey together. And so what I do and what Ed does, what Jack does, Mo, Joe, what we're discussing this week, I think we're all working together and we're all moving to push that ball forward. I've also become convinced that much of the error surrounding this passage occurs simply because people are not allowing the text to speak for itself. I know that can become a mantra for us. We can say that often, but I think that is really the more I looked at this passage, yes, there are problems. Yes, it's difficult. I mean, this is controversial. This is 1,800, maybe 1,900 years of debate over what is happening in this passage. So obviously we're not going to answer all the questions, and we can't simplify it. We can't get simplistic with it. I think one of our fundamental errors is we've tried to simplify it to the point where it becomes reductionist. We don't do justice to the text. We don't answer some of those hard questions, and it can't be that we just dismiss it with, well, you just haven't read the passage. At the same time, I have become convinced that a lot of the error out there is because people simply aren't doing the hard work of trying to understand, and it's there. The answer is here. If we just bother to let the text speak for itself. And a lot of times, that's the issue. Now, the Sermon on the Mount's Old Testament backdrop is as controversial as it is colorful. If the sermon is the most argued about passage in the Scriptures, one fundamental reason why is the wide diversity of opinion regarding its place in redemptive history. Now, how one understands this sermon's relationship to the Old Testament has a fundamental impact on just about every facet of the Christian experience, which is why I think it's kind of silly for us to say that this sermon has nothing to do with New Covenant theology. You know, at its most basic level, we have to interact with the sermon because where we go with the sermon really does say a whole lot about us and where we are, you know, exegetically, hermeneutically, and not just that. It has to do with our entire Christian experience, from one's understanding of redemptive history to how one worships on Sunday, to how one relates to God, to our brothers and sisters in Christ, how we relate to our unbelieving neighbor, how we relate to the world at large, the critical issue of Christ and culture that we want to debate and discuss. All of those issues are found here in this Sermon on the Mount. So we can't simply dismiss it. And in fact, we are going to argue it and we're going to debate it simply because it is fundamental to our Christian experience. Simply put, a Christian's view of the sermon's relationship to the Old Testament is bound up with worldview. How we understand our world, how we understand even our self-identity, much less our identity in Jesus Christ. Now, that the Old Testament and the Old Covenant have an interest in the Sermon on the Mount, we will treat as a given here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time justifying why we should be looking at the Old Testament and the sermon in the same context. One need look no further than those statements found in chapter 5, which theologians have labeled the antitheses. All 6 of the antitheses are predicated in Old Testament law. You know, each of the "you have heard it said" statements employs an Old Testament quote before moving on to the "but I say unto you" addendum, the interpretation of which obviously has inflamed so much controversy. Now, there are other quotes and allusions to the Old Testament in the sermon, but the so-called antitheses are certainly the most notable. And in fact, their very use here by Christ in this sermon forces us to talk about the Old Testament and the sermon. More important is Christ's statement in Matthew 5:17, again, usually ground zero for all of the debate about the sermon, where Christ says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Here, Christ brings the law and the prophets of the Old Testament to bear on the entire sermon. And it's this statement, "I have not come to abolish the law or the prophets," that gives rise to the antitheses in the verses following, which themselves arise from the law in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament not only provides context for the Sermon on the Mount, it's actually being quoted in the sermon. The question then becomes, if the Old Testament has a relationship to the sermon, how does Christ understand his own sermon in the context of the Old Testament? And the second, which is closely related, one that you're going to hear me reference quite a bit here in our time this morning, and that is, how does Matthew understand Christ and his sermon in the context of the Old Testament? Those two things. How does Christ understand the Old Testament in this sermon? How does Matthew, and how is Matthew portraying it? I think those two things, we have to answer those questions. Those are questions I think we tend to run from, but I think we have to answer. Before those questions can be answered, though, the structure, context, and purpose of the sermon must be considered. Now, I'm going to make this presentation available later. I'm going to quickly run through. You know, those of you that are writing things down, I'm probably going to go too fast. But the first thing we want to consider is structure. What's the structure of the sermon? Because if we understand structure, I think the most important thing, one of the things I do in my calendar year is I do take time out to go to the Simeon Trust in Wheaton. One of the reasons I do is because one of the goals is to force you to do expositional preaching, and to do expositional preaching and allowing the text to speak for itself. And one of the ways you do that is to find the structure of any given passage. Because if you can find the structure, you can unpack precisely what it was that the writer, or even Jesus Christ who is using it, wants us to understand about what is being said. So while the proposals for the sermon structure are diverse, I mean, you pick up any commentary, they've got the sermon divided, again, 100 different interpretations of the sermon, 100 different theologians, 100 different theologians, 100 different structures for the sermon. I'm of the opinion the structure can fairly be easily identified. It's the interpretation of the structure, I think, that becomes problematic, or making sense of that structure. I include in the introduction Matthew 4:23 and following into 5:1. And there's a reason for that. I think a lot of the chapter breaks that we find in the canon are artificial. So much so that you can't allow chapter break in a lot of instances to be a hermeneutical or exegetical consideration. I think that's true here. I think this section really begins in 4:23. Then you have the Beatitudes, which begin in 5:2 and end in 5:10. I think there are 8 Beatitudes, not 9. The last one, I think, is a recapitulation, a restatement of the last one. If you were to run a parallel, I'm not going to get into it. If you run a parallel between the last Beatitude, the last 2, you'll find them basically saying the same thing. Then the salt and section, 11 to 16. The I have come to fulfill section, which is 5:17 to 20. The antitheses, which is 5:21 to 48. And then you have what is typically understood as the section of the Lord's Prayer, although I believe that section begins at 6:1 and ends in verse 18. Really, it has much to do with the Lord's Prayer is couched in terms of the Father who sees in secret, rewarding you openly. That's repeated both before and after the prayer, so the prayer has to be understood in that light. The next section is about laying up treasures. That's 6:19 through 24. After that, there are 7 imperatives that are pretty easily identified with don't do, judge not, do not. So you have a series of imperatives, beware, that follow in the next section, 6:25 to 7:23. And then, towards the end, the pericope, or the story of the wise man and the foolish man, which really is about those who hear these words of mine. Christ concluding his sermon with a story that relates to the entire sermon. And then the conclusion, again, where I think there's an artificial chapter break, the conclusion for what Matthew wants us to understand as far as the sermon is actually 7:28 and 8:1. Because the crowds that follow Christ off the mountain are the same ones that follow him up. So you have him leading into this in 5:1 with Christ ascending the mountain and sitting among them. And then you have the great crowds of Matthew 4:25 actually following Christ off the mountain in 8:1. Something to be said about this structure, which runs to the heart of this issue of how we understand the sermon. I'm not convinced the sermon can be easily sectioned into the 5 books of Moses, which some have attempted to do. Some commentators have proposed this. Some commentators have proposed the book of Matthew can be divided into 5 books of Moses, and I don't think we can do that with the book of Matthew as well. I understand why they do it. Obviously, they have, and I'm not going to use the word agenda. There are some exegetical things happening in Matthew that have led some to this conclusion. I do believe there are 6 panels, and they'll dismiss one of those panels in trying to come up with these 5 books. Matthew is divided into a series of panels that follow what we call, and what I would paraphrase as, literary markers. In other words, there are things that occur systematically through Matthew that let you know that he is coming to the end of a section. There are a series of these literary markers that have to do with the statement when he had finished, or usually it's when he had finished these sayings, when he had finished this parable. These statements, there are a series of them in Matthew 7:28, 11:1, 13:53, 19:1, and 26:1. We're going to look at those in a minute. But these divide Matthew really into 6 panels. I'm not completely convinced there's a chiasm present. Some commentators have tried to do that with Matthew, or the sermon as well. There are telltale signs that there might be a chiasm present. Now, if I spent my entire life studying the Sermon on the Mount or the book of Matthew, I might see what some of them are saying is there. I'm not convinced. I do see some signs that there might be one here. Both the introduction, one of the telltale signs of chiasm, and for those of you that aren't familiar with this term, chiasm is a Jewish way of writing and speaking in such a way that you are running a series of parallel thoughts, in the middle of which is the point you're trying to make. So a chiastic structure is forming off that word chi, which means point. Chiastic structure means all of the literature, or whatever is being said, is going to come to a certain point, and that point's going to be basically in the middle of whatever you're reading or speaking. And that was a Jewish way of writing. Matthew writes chiastically. There are other chiasms in Matthew, and I've never met a chiasm I didn't like. However, and the interesting thing is, the reason I like chiasms is because of what I just said earlier. If you can understand the structure of any given passage, and there's a chiasm present, it is easy to run to the point, whatever that writer, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or the speaker, if it's Jesus Christ, and he's using a chiasm, it's very easy to run to that and say, oh, that's the point he's trying to make here. And more often than not, that keeps us from running off into silly trails and taking things out of context. If you can run to, more often than not, the point of a chiasm, if it's there in the text, is going to be counter to some piffy little saying that many are extrapolating from any said passage. Now, I say they're telltale signs. One of the things I look for are parallels at the front and the back of any given section. And if there's a parallel there, again, thinking Jewishly, I'd say you've got a pretty good chance, you stand a pretty good chance that there's a chiasm. There certainly are the telltale signs of parallelism at the front and the back. Both the introduction and the conclusion have parallelisms, as do the Beatitudes and the wise man, foolish man parable. You can take the wise man, foolish man parable and line it up as a parallel to the Beatitudes. I really believe what Christ is doing there is attempting to, as he has developed the sermon, is taking the blessed person of the Beatitudes and lining them up over against those who hear these words of mine and do not do them. He is setting up a wise man, foolish man contrast using the blessed man of the Beatitudes. There's also parallelism with the law of the prophets in 5:17 and the law and the prophets of chapter 7 of verse 12. I'm not even going to go into that, but there are some things that line up there. At the very least, the introduction and conclusion make the sermon very easy to section off from the rest of the book of Matthew, especially when the conclusion includes the first of the when he had finished statements, and we're going to look at that. So if this is a chiasm, I'm not saying it is, but seemingly the midpoint, most people that see the chiasm here, they land at the Lord's Prayer. However, and this goes back to an exegetical reason that I'm going to unpack here over time, because I think the theme here is the exceeding righteousness of the Pharisees and that whole question. I think the point of this chiasm is in 548. I think it's the midpoint of the sermon. So if this is a chiasm, the midpoint, the climax is 548. There are a couple of reasons why this makes sense. It's reflective not only of the recurrent theme of the sermon, which we're going to get to, but also the main theme of the sermon, which occurs, the main theme, I propose the thesis statement of the sermon is 5:17 to 20. And the main point that Christ is attempting to do or is portraying, the reason I say everybody lands on 5:17, I think 5:20 probably is the key point of the thesis statement. The interesting thing, if you look at Matthew 5:48, which is, be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Not only do you have the indicative imperative going there in one statement, even as your Father in heaven is perfect is the indicative from which the be perfect flows. You also have in 548 occurs as an entire phrase, as an imperative. That imperative is the imperative form of the main theme found in 520, which is, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. That's an indicative statement. You know, it's interesting. Most people run to the Beatitudes. They run to statements like, unless your righteousness exceeds. They immediately want to flip those into imperatives. I mean, how many of us have ever heard a sermon on the Beatitudes in which we are presented with them as if, okay, you need to go be meek. You need to go be poor in spirit. When in fact, these are statements of fact. Christ is not presenting these in terms of imperatives. So, if someone, for whatever reason, wants to see the Beatitudes as a new moral law, then I'm going to suggest to you that this moral law, whatever you say about it, is given in an indicative form, which is indicative of the new covenant. So I'm not one that is going to go there necessarily as far as seeing the Beatitudes as new moral law. But if you want to go there, fine, let's go there. This is given as indicative, not imperative. 548 is an imperative, but it's imperative that's on the flip side of Matthew 5:20. And we're going to get to that in a minute. Thus, the righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees, the righteousness that the blessed man hungers and thirsts after, Matthew 5:6 is tied to this. The righteousness that we're to pursue, Matthew 6:33 is tied to this. The righteousness that sets itself over against all lawlessness, that's 7:23, which is tied to this, is to be perfect, even as the Father in heaven is perfect. All right? And for those of us that are engaged in it from time to time, those in the new perspective, this lands squarely on them. Because even as perfect, yes, it may mean complete, it still means completely. And that really starts to bring to bear this sense of being perfect. And this perfectedness has a lot to do with the righteousness here. So we're not just talking about having a complete form of righteousness. We're talking about a righteousness that is complete in all aspects. So if the main thesis statement is 520, having this righteousness that exceeds, it not just has to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Christ is now bringing an imperative that is extremely severe. This righteousness has to be perfect. The agnostics, the atheists, those of higher criticism that want to read the sermon, many of them have suggested that right here Christ is being unethical, and they don't fail to see the irony in that. Even as Christ is presenting ethics, this is so severe. How could someone who claims to be God, how could someone, in their minds, how could somebody claims to be a great teacher in the long tradition of Judaism, place on his hearers such an extreme imposition? And that has led some to conclude, some to dismiss this as being totally unethical, and they dismiss the sermon as something that we cannot and should not put in front of people as an ideal to be lived up to. And the interesting thing is I would agree with that. Christ does want to make this severe, but he does it because he is sitting there as the answer, and we'll get to that in a minute. Not only does 548 sit at the center of the sermon's thrust, it is unpacked. Well, let me stop right here since this is what we're doing. Any questions so far about anything that I've said?
What's most interesting is where you're going, and I'm ready. And I don't want any more conversation. I want to go.
Okay. Well, the Lord has spoken.
Through Moses.
By the way, may I have some water out of the fridge?
Yes.
Is this it? Thank you. Thank you, sir. I apologize. I meant to get some before coming in. Not only does 548 sit at the center of the sermon's thrust, it's then unpacked throughout the rest of the book. This is one of those new things that I saw and just blew me away. The Greek word for perfect in 548 is the same word that is used in those literary markers that set off the 6 panels of Matthew. The same word, perfect, is finished. So as you then move through the rest of Matthew, 548, and the interesting thing is, many of the commentators either would dismiss it or didn't even go there, or wasn't even on their radar because it didn't occur to them that this is what is happening. But as I saw it, I was like, oh my word. But 548 really sits at the front end of these literary markers and sets them up. So let's look at those statements. 728 and 8:1. I'm going to do a lot of this morning. When Jesus finished or perfected these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching when he came down. Chapter 11, verse 1. By the way, if you're like me and you like to mark up your Bibles, I would mark up these literary markers because they really do help you see and understand what's going on in Matthew. And if I had more time, and if I had more study time, it'd be absolutely fascinating to see what's occurring around these literary markers, but I haven't had time to go there. 11:1. When Jesus had finished or had perfected instructing his 12 disciples, he went from there to teach and preach in their cities. 13:53 through 54. And when Jesus had finished or perfected these parables, he went away from there And coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue so that they were astonished. And then over to chapter 19, verse 1. Now when Jesus had perfected these sayings, he went away from Galilee. Crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Then over to 26, verse 1. And here Matthew tosses in an extra word, which again I found absolutely fascinating because of where it occurs and how he wants us to understand this book. When Jesus had finished, or when Jesus had perfected all these sayings, he said to his disciples. Now, don't miss the word all. There's an intention of Matthew to show that the finality of Christ's perfection of his work, and in these instances, Christ's teachings. Some have suggested these finished statements are setting off great discourses in Matthew, and I certainly, again, as I see it, that's probably occurring here. But let's not lose sight of the fact this was all set up by Christ when he used the same word. Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. So there's an intention in Matthew here in Matthew 26:1 to show the finality of Christ's perfection of his work and his teaching. And he's really setting up then Christ's death and resurrection. So that there is a finality coming, a finality to his teaching. There's a finality coming to the rest of Christ's work. The other interesting thing, and I'm just going to allude to these, we're going to go back through these very quickly. There's something else going on here in the literary markers that ties them to the Sermon on the Mount. The fascinating thing is most of the main elements occurring in the prelude to the sermon and what's happening after occur in these literary markers. Most of the main elements of Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, and Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, which is at the front end and the back end of the sermon, are present in these literary markers. The words or thoughts of finished, he went, teaching and preaching, healing. So listen to 4:23 in light of all these literary markers that you've just read. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease. Great crowds followed him. That's how the sermon is set up. Listen to 7:28. This is at the back end of the sermon. The crowds were astonished at his teaching. He came down. All right. Then move over to 7:28. The crowds were astonished at his teaching. 11:1. Jesus instructed. Jesus went there and preached. 13:53 and 54. Jesus taught them in their synagogues, and they were astonished. Chapter 19, verse 1. Large crowds followed Jesus, and he healed them. The main elements surrounding the sermon and contextualizing the sermon contextualize all of the book of Matthew. So the first thing that we can say, especially as we think about this word perfect and finished, the first thing we can say that these markers are completing what was begun in 423. Understood in light of the fulfillment, which I think is inherently tied to this word perfect. Understood in light of the fulfillment talked about in Matthew 17, these literary markers point to an ongoing, progressive fulfillment in the ministry and teaching of Jesus Christ. What was started in 423 is continued and perfected through the rest of the book. This perfecting of what was started in 423, the beginning of the sermon, has everything to do with being perfect, even as our Father in heaven, even as Christ's Father in heaven is perfect, with a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. What started in 423 and is being perfected throughout the rest of the book has everything to do with perfecting the righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Has everything to do with perfecting the righteousness after which those who are blessed hunger and thirst. This perfecting throughout the book of Matthew has everything to do with providing kingdom citizens with the satisfaction of our deepest longings, cravings, and appetites. We hunger and we thirst after righteousness, a righteousness that is being perfected by Jesus Christ throughout the book of Matthew. Thus, the theme of Christ's righteousness, the theme of that righteousness being perfected, this, again, Matthew 5:48, is tied to the unfolding of the events in the book of Matthew. And it helps provide an interpretive context for the series of finished statements. So we can't see these literary markers in Matthew outside of the context provided in the Sermon on the Mount. You begin to see why the Sermon on the Mount is so important to our understanding of who we are, what Christ is doing, what he accomplished in the cross and resurrection, how he stands at the very end of Matthew on a mountain, no less, and says, all authority has been given to me.
That's right.
All authority has been given to him because he has perfected all that he came to accomplish. One final note, we're not going to get to this right now, one final note about 548 is that it too has an Old Testament backdrop. I mean, how many of you, when you hear, be ye perfect, I mean, that's the old King James Version, even as your Father in heaven is perfect, what should come to what would come to the Jewish mind? Yeah, absolutely. Be holy, for I am holy. Be holy, for the one who brought you out of Egypt is holy. So we'll unpack that a little later. I want you to see that, though. Christ places Leviticus right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And basically says, I have come to fulfill and perfect that. All right. Any questions about what we said so far? How am I doing on time?
I think fine.
I think exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees and the whole school, I mean, they had no righteousness of any heavenly value. And to see how this becomes a life of God's people.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Christ always has these really kind of cool things that he does in the way he's, yeah, imagine that. And the way he interacts with the Pharisees. I mean, you bring up a very interesting point, and that's something I hadn't prepared to talk about. When he talks about exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees, obviously, everybody knows. I mean, he calls them whitewashed walls. And that's probably the nicest thing he's said about them in the series of woes. But the interesting thing is, he brings up the exceeding righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, almost like the same thing that we do in, okay, for the sake of the argument, let's say. We do the same thing. So he's doing that. For the sake of the argument that I'm about to make, let's assume that there is righteousness to be had in the scribes and Pharisees.
It could have also been the view of the people viewing them.
Correct. So he's contextualizing with his audience. I mean, they were understood to be the righteous ones of that day. Even Second Temple Judaism shows us that. So it's kind of interesting. It would have been, obviously hindsight's always 20/20, and we obviously have the inspired word to help us see these things. to wonder if he had a wry smile when he said it. Because certainly, understanding what we know to be true about the Pharisees, their righteousness was not what they claimed it to be. Yes,
I
Dave.
was just going to make mention of for those who don't know Greek, that the word for that you're talking about as far as perfect,
Yeah.
this is telos, right, or teleo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got some very significant meaning in the rest of the New Testament, particularly Christ is the end of the law, it's the telos of the law. So there's a broader.
Well, and he uses a variation where.
He does, yeah.
Where's the ultimate?
Nominal and verbal.
Where's the ultimate variation found? He's on the cross.
Yeah, exactly.
And he uses a variation of that word.
Yeah.
He has brought the entire Old Testament. We'll get to the law and prophets in a minute. He's brought everything to its finality and has wrapped up in one person all of that finality. It's interesting. We tend to look at that word as if, okay, that's the end point. Yeah, I mean, at its basic level, sure. That's not what Christ, that's not how Christ is using it. And certainly as we unpack everything that is happening in the Gospels, finished, teleo, has so much more implication. We do a severe injustice if we just, okay, that's the end. He's done. Well, no, he's not done. Which is, how many of you took EE, Evangelism Explosion? I mean, the Tetelestai, and it is finished, the debts are paid and all, which is also being utilized there. But when Christ says that it's finished, yes, there's a forensic aspect to it. Yes, there's an exchange element to it. But more importantly, in terms of the Old Testament, he's saying, this is it. I have fulfilled, I have filled up to its fullest measure everything I came to do and everything that was said about me. So, any others? I've just now added. I can go back to the manuscript and start typing.
Have you ever, has anyone ever done any work or connected this to Alpha and Omega?
No, but you raise an interesting, and certainly that would be, I only looked at Matthew, but I really haven't done any study, a lot of study in Revelation. I've done a lot of study in 1 John and a bit in John, but that would be in perfect keeping with the way John is portraying Christ and is talking about Christ.
The other thing I found a little surprising is that John was the one that in 1930 where that expression comes up, and he's the only one that recorded it. With what you're explaining about the panels of Matthew and these markers, I'm a little surprised that Matthew wasn't the one to plug it in.
Yeah, the point you raise here is it could have just as easily been Matthew. The more I study these things, we do a disservice, I think, when we start talking synoptics. Synoptics is a literary term, it's a scholarship term, and obviously we understand what it means. Now, I'm going to throw in this for free. Do I think they were all working off probably a similar manuscript or similar accounts? Yeah, probably. Does that mean there's a queue? No, I don't know that that's true or not. However, as the Gospels unfold from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's obvious all of them are working from the same framework. You can't throw or pit one against the other, because even as they unpack each of their things in their own way, they're unpacking the same person, and a lot of the same thoughts are present. Now, obviously, because Matthew was written to a certain audience, Mark was written to a different audience, Luke was written to Theophilus and whatever church he was involved with, and then John had his audience. So you're going to have differences there. But I think when we start talking synoptics, we do some major damage to the way all four of these eyewitness accounts really interact with each other and are saying a lot of the same things. We can't, synoptics, I almost think inherently pits one against the other, and I think that's just, we can't go there. So
I'm left wondering, based on emphasis on the word all in 26:1, if that would have been kind of anticlimactic for Matthew, and there may even be a sense in which he's focusing on the word, making a different point that his usage of these markers, it's already been brought to a conclusion by 26:1, and that the issue of the language from the cross in John 19:30 would have been, I don't know, some sort of an anticlimax. I don't know if I'm on dangerous ground there, but it does seem like Matthew, that's kind of a concluding statement. What he's doing with that word is done by 26:1, and so it's a moot point for his usage of it, whatever Christ said from the cross.
I think on that point, the interesting thing is most all of these, when it comes to these finished statements, I'm going to track later the word fulfill through Matthew. Something a little different's going on there. But as these finished words here appear in Matthew, these are pretty much specifically tied to teaching. What's coming out of Christ's mouth. And it's coming in different forms. Some of it was proclamation, some of it was dialogue, teaching. Some of it was parable. Regardless of how it's coming out, he's tying this to the verbalization. So I think, to answer your question, there's a finality to this perfection, or being perfect, or fulfilling righteousness, especially as Christ has explained it, taught it, has perfected it. How his words itself, it's interesting. If you start tying these thoughts together, the words themselves are bringing things to fruition. What has left to be done then after 526 is actually accomplishing the fact. The event itself, everything that has led up to that point. You see, this is why I don't think we can be so chronological that we miss what Matthew was wanting us to see. This appears in a chronology, and certainly the use of the word all at the end, I think, shows a progress to this perfection. In other words, he is perfecting as he goes, and then it's done. So in that sense, there is a chronology, but I don't think we can press chronology too far, because we're going to miss, like you said, it's going to be anticlimactic. Certainly the resurrection is the climax. So what has yet to be accomplished is actually the carrying out, or the doing aspect of it. That's a good point. Anything else? All right, the context of the sermon. We're going to look at the immediate context, because I think, remember I said, we don't let the text speak for itself. When we don't let the text speak for itself, we run into quite a bit of error. And this is one place where I think in our interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, if we don't let the context help us interpret, we're going to miss some things, and then I think we're going to go off on the deep end. So let's go back to 4:23. I'm going to read this entire passage right here. Matthew 4:23 and following. This is what Jesus Christ was proclaiming to us. He went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. In the development of the Sermon on the Mount as an important passage for understanding the new covenant, little attention is given by commentators, pastors, and theologians to the passage immediately preceding the sermon. And this is unfortunate, for it's there we find the historical and theological context for the sermon. In fact, I think it's the historical and theological underpinnings for the sermon. The first thing we could say about this immediate context, what we find in Matthew 4:23, is that Christ has the ear of the whole Jewish world. There's a lot of debate. Who's Christ talking to in the sermon? And even answers to that question have people skewed and going off the deep end. I know of some people, I've never met them, but I got a friend of mine who has a father-in-law who claims the Sermon on the Mount was only for those disciples on that mount at that particular time, and nothing here applies to us. I don't think we can go there based on the context. The whole world, the whole known world, the whole known Jewish world is Christ's stage, even if it's Israel who's the intended audience. Notice the parallels as you walk through this immediate context. He went throughout all Galilee. His fame spread throughout all Syria. So there you have Galilee and Syria not contrasted, but they're being posited in parallel. Christ's message, Christ's fame, is throughout all Israel. In fact, it's beyond Israel. It's to Syria. These are two simultaneous events. As Christ does one, as he travels throughout all Galilee, his fame is being spread throughout all Syria. Note the language as to who is taking note of Christ's fame and Christ's message. Even as Christ is traveling throughout all Galilee, and even as his fame is being spread abroad, and in this case Syria, which is next door neighbors, but they're outside of these boundaries that Matthew is showing us here. Even as Christ is doing this, the who becomes important. He goes over all Galilee. His fame is being spread through all of Syria, and then he says, great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis and from Jerusalem and Judea and beyond the Jordan. Now, what has Matthew done here? Well, if you know anything about Palestine in Christ's day, he's just painted for you north, south, east, and west. This is a description of what had been the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, he's talking about on the other side of Jordan. He's already mentioned, by the way, the other side of Jordan. The Decapolis was on the other side of Jordan and made up the 2.5 tribes that were. So this is a description of all Israel. Even as Christ's fame has spread beyond the borders of old Israel, Israel itself is taking notice, and Israel itself is now beginning to follow Christ as he travels throughout all of Galilee. The second thing we must note here, not only does Christ have the ear and have the attention of all of Israel, the second thing we must note is Christ's activity, and this becomes important as we think about the sermon and its relationship to the Old Testament. Verse 23, and he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. This activity, this message that has Israel's ear, has a threefold angle to it as far as this activity is concerned: teaching, proclaiming, and healing. Much more could how this threefold activity of Christ unfolds throughout the rest of the book of Matthew. There will be more to say about how this activity drips in significance and fulfillment. What we need to see at this point of our discussion is this activity leads into the sermon. This activity leads into Christ's ascent of the mount to deliver his sermon. Christ ascends the mount to teach. It says that in 5:1 and 5:2. What he delivers there on the mount is the gospel of the kingdom. And in bringing the gospel of the kingdom to his people, he is bringing healing. There's a twofold aspect of this healing. Obviously, there's the physical healing. But the Old Testament is clear. And we're going to look at Isaiah in a moment, but Isaiah is clear that the advent of the one coming that is teaching and preaching is going to bring healing. And it's not just physical healing. This proclamation on the mount is bringing healing to all of Israel. And Israel certainly at this point is in need of healing. He does it in didactic form. So there's a connection between verse 23 in chapter 4 and then in chapter 5. Christ taught. Christ is going over all Galilee, teaching and proclaiming. Christ ascends the mount, and he taught them, saying. So there's a didactic angle to this. There's also, when I say didactic, what I mean is that it is in dialogue form. Now, as this sermon unfolds, we don't see any dialogue. So there's something else going on here. But Matthew brings taught into it. I think he wants us to see that this gospel of the kingdom does have a dialogue or a didactic nature to it. There is a teacher and there is a listener. There are those who are engaged with the teacher on the mount. However, there is also unilateral action going on here. This is also monologue or unidirectional communication. By the way, there is also healing going on incarnationally. There is an incarnational form to the communication here. Christ teaches the gospel of the kingdom in dialogue. Christ preaches the gospel of the kingdom in unidirectional monologue. And Christ incarnates the gospel of the kingdom in healing sick Israel in the sermon. That threefold activity consumes Christ throughout the course of his life on earth. if we were to trace, and Jack was talking about, how the Gospels relate to, if we won Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, this idea, teaching, preaching, healing, this threefold activity really consumes Christ and takes up most of his ministry. We find him again and again, and you'll see Matthew, and this becomes big in certain areas where people really get off track when they start talking about ethics and whether teaching is primarily about ethics. Now, this is about gospel, but it's teaching, preaching, and healing that consume Christ in his ministry, and certainly that's occurring here in this sermon. The third thing we want to note in this lead up to the sermon, in this context, are the crowds. A fascinating study, and especially Mark. Mark is really fascinated with crowds. You should go through Mark sometime and just circle crowds and then see what's happening between Christ and crowds. Matthew has a little bit of that going on as well, not as much as Mark. But there is some of that here. Not only do the crowds, he's going to use this word crowds as a linchpin between the last part of chapter 4 in the Sermon on the Mount and the bookend of the sermon. We've already looked at that. The language, great crowds followed him. That's in 423 and following, and 425. Seeing the crowds occurs in 5. And then in 8:1, great crowds followed him. So we have great crowds followed him at both the front end and the back end of the sermon. What we have leading into the sermon in the immediate context is a total engagement of Israel with this phenomenon named Jesus. What occurs here and throughout the rest of the book of Matthew is not confined to one subgroup, the disciples. It's crowds. And it's crowds that are from north, south, east, west of Israel. This person from Galilee, that becomes an important thing as you trace what's going on here throughout the book of Matthew. This person from Galilee has gathered and in some sense has united Israel with his proclamation of the kingdom. Now, not everybody follows him. That becomes obvious as you get to the end of Matthew. But Matthew wants us to see, especially in the language he's using, great crowds follow Christ from north, south, east, and west. And so this message, this healing, is uniting all of Israel. He has all of Israel's ears. So as he ascends the mount, this is a sermon delivered not just to the 12 disciples, and I'm not going to get into that part of the context. That certainly is here, because he calls his disciples out from, you want to talk about ecclesia here, he calls them out of north, south, east, and west Israel. He has a certain group here, and Matthew identifies them as the ones around him on the mount. And there's a lot you can start to trace Old Testament themes about gathering around yourself certain followers and then dispensing the law. I mean, Exodus comes to mind in the fact that the elders went with Moses up to the mountain when the law was delivered. So there's some things going on here with disciples. But let's not miss the fact that leading into this, he says great crowds. Yeah, the disciples are there in the immediate context. This is for the crowds. This is for all of Israel. All right? There's one more thing to note, and that's the content of the proclamation. The content of the proclamation is the gospel of the kingdom. But before I get to that, any questions?
Chad, would you connect 5:1 and 2 to 7:28? I think you just did, but I mean, would you make that and use that as a point that he wasn't just teaching the disciples, but they weren't the only hearers of what it says here?
Yeah, that's why I'm saying, I think Matthew, again, thinking biblically, theologically, and the way Matthew is writing, Matthew wants us to see he's not bringing, we're going to get to whether or not he's wanting to use Moses as a figure here. But I do think he wants us to see this group of disciples around Christ on the Mount. Because at the end, in 28, chapter 28, and verses 16 to 20, where we have the Great Commission, the so-called Great Commission, and everything going on there, he's back on a mount, and he's with his disciples. So you also have a bookend in Matthew going on with this idea of the disciples being on a mount with Christ. He does the same thing in the middle of his ministry with the Transfiguration, where he pulls disciples up the mount with him. So you've got something going on here with Matthew. I'm bringing this up because I want us, there is a segment in their interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount that this is aimed at the disciples. And I'm saying, no, Christ has the ear of entire Israel in view. Yes, he talks about the disciples being up there, but as you point out, there are both at the front and the back end thoughts, there are clues that Matthew sees crowds there as well, because it says, seeing the crowds, he went up the mount. He's not avoiding them, because it says great crowds followed him, and he came down. There's interaction. The crowds were there. So we can't just segment off the disciples as if they're the only crowd here. And it's because that is an exegetical point to be made in seeing crowds here at the Sermon on the Mount.
The only way around that I see is for someone to go to 28 and say the people were astonished at his doctrine, say, well, the people were the disciples. They'd have to limit that change of terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
They would
yes.
be using a different word to say the same
Yep.
thing. That doesn't explain the change. And then he come down from the mountain. Well, the great multitude didn't follow him down off the mountain. They were still waiting at the bottom or something.
I think Davies, W.D. Davies, no, it's Kingsbury. I get them all confused. I've read so many guys in the last 3 or 4 weeks. Actually, last year. This is an interesting discussion because now you're bringing up something. There are some commentators who will like to suggest that because he says disciples at the front end and then uses crowds at the back end, that those crowds were actually disciples. In other words, he's talking about this larger group of 70 or 120 that we typically identify as those who follow Christ. Again, because of the lead-in, I don't go there, and Davies dismisses that as well. I don't go there precisely because of what's happening in 423. And it's obvious, the way it unfolds in Matthew later, that not all of these crowds are disciples. In fact, I'm convinced the way crowds and the way things are unpacked in the rest of Matthew, I'm certain there were scribes and Pharisees in that audience as well. So we can't, some are going to take what you just said and want to see, okay, well then that means the disciples of 5:1 and 2 are the crowds of 7:28 and 8:1. No. I think we have to also include in that 423 and following when we start to develop this idea of crowds. So that, again, it's delivered to all of Israel. And I think also the rest of Matthew bears that out, the rest of the book. We have to take the whole book into consideration at that point.
And then to respond, and perhaps you've already done this, or others here have as well, to those like I would call hyper-dispensationalists who say, well, this is spoken to the disciples
Yep.
then and there, and granting to them this is a historical passage, that is the fact of the matter, but run them to 2 Timothy 3, doesn't matter whether it's Old Testament, back there with Moses, doesn't matter whether it's in the Gospels, that side of the cross with the disciples, is the Scripture, then it's profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, and that profit has the result of equipping us, and then the burden of proof is on them, then you need to explain to me how you profit from this and how it equips you to serve God better.
Well, the other thing too, I think they're making a, let's grant them, again, for the sake of the argument, and I don't. I think we do severe injustice if we don't see all of Israel here. We do severe injustice both to the text and then how we understand it. But if, for the sake of the argument, we grant, like you just did, it's just disciples here. What they have failed to consider, I think, is one of those critical exegetical and hermeneutical considerations as to the fact that, okay, you're only explaining who was there at the time that that event occurred. What you haven't done is explain to me how Matthew's audience would have understood it, because now Matthew, there's a second audience involved. The second audience is the people to whom Matthew is writing and then circulating his letter, this gospel. That's, and you go back to a presupposition that all of us would hold here, goes back to 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. Matthew would not include that in this passage if he did not want those that he was writing to, if they didn't have some stake in what was happening here. It would not be included in the canon. It would not have been included in Matthew's witness and account. He sticks that in the account because the people that he's writing to, and I haven't, I don't want to go there, but that original audience, the church that is going to get Matthew's original eyewitness accounts, he wants them to see themselves at the mount there with them. They have a stake in what's being explained here. So even if we grant that it was just the disciples with Christ on that mount, and it was only to them, and they're the only ones that were the recipients of this, or they're the only originally intended audience, you haven't begun to explain why Matthew includes it here for the church, to whatever church he's writing to and giving this eyewitness account to. You haven't explained to me why he does that for them, and what that audience was supposed to get out of this text. And I would argue that that audience, Matthew's audience, is us. It's the same audience. We occur in the same point in redemptive history, post-resurrection, post-ascension. Whatever they were supposed to get, we're supposed to get out of it because we share with them. We sit side by side with Matthew's original audience as, again, if it was now a Christian synagogue or a house church, and they are having this read to them, I am sitting here next to Matthew's original audience. I am to understand what they were supposed to be getting. They miss that. If you're going to limit that to the disciples, you miss that. And the interesting thing is, as I sit here with Matthew, one of the things I'm doing today, one of the reasons why we even have to consider Old Testament, as I sit here with Matthew's audience and I listen to Matthew, I'm supposed to understand and be hearing Old Testament. My ears are going to perk up when I hear in the antitheses, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. And then Christ goes and does something not completely different, but is doing something with those texts. There's, Matthew's audience is they're gonna feel the weight of that because they understand. We're having this discussion today because we don't understand our Old Testaments. Mm-hmm. We don't understand the Old Testament relationship with the New Testament. We don't understand what Matthew wants his listeners to hear because we don't get it. Back to that argument or that consideration last night. We're accused of being Marcionites. Well, that's because some of what we write, and I say right, broadly speaking, New Covenant, we haven't engaged the Old Testament properly. And in fact, too many just want to dismiss it. Yeah, Mike.
I think Christ makes that distinction of, we're talking about the two crowds, and you lose
Yeah.
preaching, teaching in chapter 9 when he talks about, Lord of the harvest.
Mm-hmm.
He makes that distinction. He has compassion on the crowds, yet he's talking specifically to his disciples also. So we have that distinction. There's not just one group.
Absolutely.
Christ himself makes that distinction.
Yeah, Ed.
Yeah, and there's also a sense, as you were talking about the audience of this gospel, there's a sense here, you could paraphrase that, and those who truly followed him got where they could hear. They
Yes.
focused their attention.
Yeah.
They went and got front row seats.
The interesting thing, and again, we're going to, a bit later, look at whether or not Matthew wants us to see Moses here on the mount. One of the things I think Matthew is doing, again, even as I don't think Moses is at the forefront, I do think Moses is here. One of the things that is happening, Old Testament, the picture that comes to, again, I'm sitting here next to Matthew's original audience, and we see crowds. We see disciples. You're thinking, first of all, elders, the elders of Israel accompanying Moses up to a mount. By the way, where was the crowd at the giving of the law and Moses dispensing the law? Where was the crowd?
Foot of the mountain.
At the foot of the mountain. What's happening here?
Come on up.
You don't think there's a distinction between Old Covenant and New Covenant? The very fact that there are people on the mountain with Christ, the crowds have ascended with Christ, is because this isn't the Old Covenant anymore. You can't go there. You think Christ has come to reinforce the law in the sermon? I'm sorry. There are crowds with him up there. Even the pictures that Matthew is painting in our heads of what is taking place argue against it. Crowds were not allowed on the mount in the Old Covenant. We cannot say Christ is simply reinforcing and bringing back a true interpretation of the law. Otherwise, those crowds would be off the mount. The fact that they're with him on the mount means this is a new day, this is a new era, something different is going on. Yeah, Mr. Moe.
It's interesting too, when you have from Matthew 5, 3 and on, blessed are, he's basically describing attributes. And then he really brings it home personal to the crowd. And he says, uses this you language, blessed are you and others revile you. Verse 11. Verse 12, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. And then verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. So he's bringing it right home to them, because if I was sitting in the immediate vicinity, I would say, well, wait a minute, this is all impacting me. I am the person who, because of my identity with him, am going to suffer the oppression that this evil age will heap upon us because of our identification with him. At Sinai, didn't have that kind of identification. It was really a separation between God and the people that he's calling to be his people. He wants them to be placed in such a relationship, but it's just not going to happen because of the hardness of their hearts, because they're stony hearts.
Well, and that is a great point. And some of the men that I dearly love, in fact, some that I listen to, some people that have impacted me and how I understand the Old Testament, will immediately affirm that this is a new day and that Christ really wants and is inviting. But if you're going to say that, and if you're going to embrace this as a new Moses, you can't say that without then leaving the Old Covenant or the Old Law as is. In fact, again, like I said, you can't bring those people up to the mountain without having some sort of severe and radical distinction, departure, abrogation of the law itself. It can't have. Christ can't bring those people to himself and invite them up to the mountain. Have that intimate, personal relationship with them as a shepherd. I think shepherd imagery is here as well with the crowds. You can't have that without also having some severe and radical things to say about the law and the prophets, because it's all intertwined. What they want is they want the one, and they don't want to say anything about the other. And it's all encompassing. It's all under, it's all under Christ's review at that point.
I somehow use this picture of our Lord and Savior. I heard this great message years ago at Seaside Heights. Dr. Sinclair Ferguson preached at Isaiah 6, and of course we love to be in that temple scene and to see this great vision and be there trembling in our boots as it's unfolded before us. But the same God that appeared to the prophet Isaiah in that deep and dark hour is the same God who comes to his father's house in Israel, in Jerusalem, and he's not welcome. But what does he do? This same God, clothed in flesh, takes a little walk down the road, about a mile and a half or whatever it was, to a place in Bethany, and he sits down with his friends, the same God who appeared to Isaiah, okay, in chapter 6, the same God who appeared on the mount, sits in the dining room or the living room with his friends as we're gathered here right now, communing with them, eating with them, and welcoming them, and being that shepherd as you describe him, caring for their souls one-on-one. Blows me away. That's what New Covenant theology brings us. If it doesn't bring us there, we have a problem.
Well, that's what the incarnation does in our New Covenant theology. And the danger, again, and we use it, and we will continue to use it at Clear Creek Chapel, and that's Sproul's Holiness of God series. It's great. Changed my thinking on a lot of things. One danger, though, I think that's missing is the incarnational aspect to it and the foreverness. There is a change that the incarnation brings where we simply can't go back to the Isaiah experience the same way anymore. Now, that's not to say, Ananias and Sapphira occur in the New Covenant and for a purpose, to remind us, among other things, that we're dealing with a same righteous and holy God. But if you take the entire New Testament experience and writing as a whole, the incarnation brings with it a new dimension that they didn't have. Going back to, they had all the same things in the Old Covenant. They didn't have in the Old Covenant. Again, crowds follow Christ up the mount. He is looking at them as this shepherd king, and he is doing it because this is a new day and a new era, and the incarnation makes it possible. So that, yes, we come to Mount Zion when we gather together and worship Hebrews 12, and certainly our God is still a consuming fire. But there is an aspect that we shouldn't lose sight of it, that the incarnation brings us something I think we're always in danger of if we're always emphasizing Isaiah. And there is a whole segment of Reformed theology out there. All they do is emphasize the transcendence of God, the holiness of God, and I don't think that is what we are left with in the incarnation. We ourselves are being invited up to the mount to hear Christ. He who hears these words of mine and does them. That means me. That means all of us. That is everyone who follows, everyone who is part of this church experience. Anybody reading Matthew. Everyone who's been called out in the ecclesia, if we're going to go there, is being welcomed up to the mount with Jesus Christ. And he has something to say. And we better pay attention. But it's not something, again, like you said, we don't have to fear. He is calling us up in grace. In fact, that is unfolded in the sermon. Again, I go back to this hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Christ wants us to see he is the one after whom we hunger and thirst. We go up the mount because that's where we're going to get fed. That's where we're going to get a drink of water.
Let's take a break. Good point.
All right.
Right there. Give your voice a little rest too.
And I need it.